women become more evident as we move from more to less visible forms of homelessness and from more restricted to more encompassing definitions of homelessness. No, it's not neutral, the kind of definition that we decide to use, either when we design a service, when we build up a strategy, when we design our intervention. So it's very important that we think about the definitions that we use, because then we will see different things and we will have to deal with different realities, and we have to provide different responses and different services. And we move on from the now to what we know, to what drawing on the evidence there is across Europe, the studies, the research, which is often more robust research, other more qualitative research, more localized research. I brought you some ideas to share with you about this, what we know about women's homelessness across Europe. So the first important issue is that women appear more likely than men to live in situations of hidden homelessness, what we call hidden homelessness. We found, for example, in this 2014 review of homelessness statistics that we did within the observatory, that homeless women seem to have a better access to family, to make more use of family and friends offering social supports than men. This does not mean that men are not using this kind of support. It's just that from the evidence that we have in different countries, we see that women tend to use more this kind of resource. And this can be some kind of short-term accommodation, also financial support. So this is more evident among homeless women and among homeless men. So they have more options to be in these concealed situations or these hidden situations. And it also seems that there is this pattern across many countries in Europe, in many cities, in many regions, where you see that women tend to exhaust these informal resources to sustain a roof over their heads as much as possible before they seek assistance from services. And Raquel was just presenting the figures on victimization. And you see here what we also see in other contexts, that in fact women are much more subjected to victimization when they are experiencing these more open and not hidden forms of homelessness. And so one of the strategies precisely to avoid victimization may be this using these more hidden forms of support. So women tend to rely on these informal supports. They only approach services very often, sometimes at a later stage, and when these supports are exhausted. And what happens is that what we see is that women's homelessness are hidden. We call it hidden because they are being homeless, but within housing solutions, within housing arrangements. So they are enduring very difficult situations within housing, but we do not very often consider them as being homeless, and we do not look at this reality until it comes up into the open. So in order to, so they really value being able to keep safe. Even when they sleep rough, when they live rough, you see that they hide and they find ways of hiding. And it would be very interesting to understand whether these differences between that you saw also in Raquel's presentation. I'm sorry to just be musing because it was very interesting, and I was thinking about many things when I was listening to her. And when you were comparing these figures between the survey you did and the figures from the the available services, and there were these mismatches that people had not been found, for example, even those that had been on the day centers on the following morning. Many of these people had not been found the night before, and it would be very interesting to know if there is a gender difference in these people who were not found the day after, if there's any gender difference between these people, if women were more likely to conceal themselves the night before, but then they were present in the day centers. I'm not sure, I don't know, but it would be interesting to explore that. So what we know is that it is crucial to better understand these hidden forms of homelessness, namely because we need to be sure that this hypothesis that we have in Europe, but also that we have from the United States, for example, that homeless women, but also female-headed lone parent families, that they have this tendency to exhaust these informal helps. We have to be sure that this is really robust evidence before seeking services. And we also need to understand whether this hidden homelessness is something that is more long-term, a more long-term experience, or if this is something that is more occasional in terms of a strategy which women use in order to find solutions to their vulnerability and to their situations. So we need to explore in more detail these aspects. And we need to explore this taking into consideration not only the structural factors that we know that are extremely important and we saw also enumerated before, but also within these structural factors, not to forget about the issue of agency, of women's also making choices within their trajectories. And they are within the structural constraints, they also are not deprived of agency, and when they are risking this housing instability, these various forms of insecure housing. And so we need to understand also the decisions of homeless women, because they are also central if we want to provide adequate responses and if the services want to meet the needs of these women and what they really value when they want to access and when they want to use the services. So we need to understand also this issue. And we also know, although with a lot of gaps in the knowledge that exists across Europe, but we also know that there are some gender intersections with motherhood, and this is not very well developed. But there are some research which shows us that there are particular vulnerabilities as regards housing instability and risks for homelessness among these intersections with motherhood, and that women's routes into homelessness, we know that they are complex. There are very factors and events which influence these routes, and we see that there are across Europe homelessness among women and their children has been found to have links with individual and structural factors, including family violence, and we have already talked about this, relationship breakdown, with poverty, but also the lack of affordable housing. We have factors also relating very specifically to mothers, to young mothers. We have studies which show us that young mothers often are forced to leave the family home due, for example, to a pregnancy, and this may be a trigger to this situation, but they also are forced to leave because they want to protect their children from physical or sexual abuse within the home. And so, when these women enter into this situation of homelessness, there are a lot of challenges relating also to parenting responsibilities within, for example, services, and also a stigma among these women, among homeless women who experience homelessness and who are mothers but who are not living with their children, because very often homeless women who are mothers but who are not living they are separated from their children, and children are not in their care. They often they are not recognized as mothers by services. They are considered as single homeless women, when in fact they are also mothers. They are just not taking care of their children, and there's a stigma associated also to this, which we will talk about a little bit further away. And we also know that women with children are prioritized in access to services. So this can act in both ways, not because they are mothers, but because the presence of children tends to provoke a more immediate response from services to protect the children, and which means that those women who have children but whose children are not in their care have a completely different response in terms of the type of services they can exceed. But I need to move on also quickly. Another important issue is that relates to family homelessness. So we see that family homelessness is also highly gendered. Homeless families are in most of the countries from which we have information on, from where research exists, we also know that homeless families are much less likely to present with this kind of severe mental illness, addiction, and other high and complex support needs than long-term and recurrently homeless adults, women or men. So family homelessness is also an important aspect which directly relates to the presence of women among homelessness. Within the European Observatory, we produced this year, it's still not released, a comparative study on family homelessness. It will be ready by the end of the year. And this study on families homelessness, which included 14 countries, what we saw, one of the major outcomes is that family homelessness is mostly experienced by lone women parents and their children at very disproportionate rates. And as I told you, this is in most countries, this is a residual problem. And again, the issue of definition has an impact on whether countries report higher or lower levels of family homelessness. I cannot get into details into this, but again, some systems tend to record, because they also respond to this, to family homelessness, tend to record more heavily these situations, whereas, for example, as UK, whereas others tend to ignore or not see this situation, but you will be able to see in detail these results when the report is out. But what we see is that unlike lone adults who experience sustained or recurrent homelessness, we know that homeless families are very unlikely to be characterized by this type of characteristics which you see there. And there is a much broader association between family homelessness, the experience of poverty, and also strong associations with the inadequacies in affordable housing, in the provision of affordable housing, in housing, the mismatch between affordability and supply of housing, and then there you see increases in family homelessness when you have this kind of problems. One of the most dramatic examples of these inadequacies is the rise in family homelessness in Dublin, which many of you probably are aware of, and which is an unfortunate example of these changes in the patterns of family homelessness, which is intimately related to these macro-level factors in the housing market and the inability of families to secure accommodation. So we see that homeless families have lower treatment and support needs, and again, this has implications in the way we tailor and in the way we develop the services. So we find that parents in homeless families do not have these high rates of severe mental illness, and the needs of homeless families are very different and very, very different from those of lone homeless people. And preventative services are absolutely essential in terms of dealing with these forms of family homelessness. And this is something that we need to recognize and to address. We also see that there are causal links between domestic violence and women's homelessness. And this you can find across Europe. It's something that domestic violence is well documented occurrence among women who experience homelessness. you have official statistics in many countries where you see that women are more likely than men to experience domestic violence and to report loss of accommodation as a consequence. You have also domestic violence being reported as a common trigger for homelessness among women in several studies across Europe. You have large numbers of homeless women reporting that they experience, when you do these qualitative studies, you see that homeless women report that they experience domestic violence at different stages, at some stages of their lives. So you have, these links are documented. But in fact, we continue to have, across Europe, the research evidence is still not as robust as we would like to have, because, and it's difficult again to compare, and it does not provide us enough information to understand the relationship between domestic violence and homelessness in their complexities. That is, how how different issues affect the women's risk of housing instability, what happens in terms of the risks of homelessness after separating from partners, after leaving refuge accommodation. So there's a lot of information that we would need in terms of understanding this relationship between domestic violence and women's homelessness. So we need more, again, more robust information on this aspect of women's homelessness. And another also important aspect regarding women's homelessness is related to migrant women. We know that migrant women also constitute a sizable, in some countries, a growing proportion of the homeless population. Again, and unfortunately, I have to say, I have always to talk about the gaps in knowledge when we talk about women's homelessness. Again, when we talk about migrant homeless women, there is some evidence that migrant women are a significant subgroup in some countries. In some countries, it reaches around 30 to 35% of the homeless migrant population, which is quite relevant. But it's very important that we need to know more about this. And again, when I was listening to Raquel's presentation, one of the information that she was giving was linked to the reason why people said that they were in a homelessness situation. And one of them was falta de papeles, lack of documents in English, so they didn't have the documents. And if you noted that, the number of women doubled the number of men which said this. And this situation is very often linked to not only to the lack of papers, but to more serious situations within the family, because we know that there are many women whose situation in the host country depends on the situation of their male partner, which means that their status in the country depends on their male partner, and if there is a problem within the couple, they can be they find it difficult to fight, for example, to leave a violent relationship if they do not have their situation, a legal situation. So this is also very important. We also know that some of these women are also financially dependent on their spouses, and this can be a problem, particularly when there are conflicts also. And this is important to clearly to know more about this, because again, services, and we also saw that women in this foreign homeless people were less satisfied with the services, also in the study before, which means that sometimes services are not responding adequately to some of these specific needs and some of these complexities that these migrant trajectories also bring. And we also know that although the experience of long-term and recurrent homelessness is highly gendered, women appear at lower rates, but they also experience long-term and recurrent homelessness. So they are, as I said before, they are in all the situations, although we know that men are more likely to appear and to be visible as regards this chronic and long-term homelessness. So in this, we know that from the available evidence, from the available research, we know that these apparently lower rates of women who experience this long-term and this recurrent homelessness is linked to the fact that women very often they experience homelessness with their children, and this, as I said before, this may give them enhanced access to welfare and health systems. We also know that some systems, some administrative systems do not record homelessness among women who experience violence, and so again, that's why also that they have other resources, and also because we know that women avoid these situations of living rough, and because women also, even when living on the streets, they conceal themselves. So, nevertheless, women may be experiencing chronic homelessness in different ways than men, and we have some interesting qualitative studies showing precisely some of the strategies that women use when they are living rough, and what we need to make sure is that if we want to prevent and if we want to reduce chronic homelessness among homeless women, we need to look also into into these types of more severe forms of homelessness also in a different way. We probably have to look also, when we do these studies on the streets, we probably have to move beyond the most visible forms of street homelessness, because some of these women may be experiencing this type of homelessness in different locations, within the open spaces, within public spaces. And so it's very important also to try and look at broader situations, broader contexts, if you want, to find even these small numbers of homeless women who apparently are living rough. And moving on to services responses to women's homelessness, but also to the use of services made by women. I will not be very exhaustive, but I will just raise some issues which I think we can then have some time to discuss here or over coffee. So a first issue is that we find a significant variation in Europe in terms of the nature, the range of services which target women who experience homelessness. And so this is very obvious. We know that across Europe, homeless people in general, they tend to get, at least even in those countries where services are very underdeveloped, at least women tend to get some support from homelessness services at least as regards basic subsistence shelter, as food, for example, food and very immediate accommodation. But we also know that the use of homeless services is highly gendered, and that we know that women do not seem to be engaging with services at the same rates as men. We said that they try to rely on informal supports. They appear in the services at a later stage, but some women may also, who do not resort to services and whose informal supports are exhausted, they may also be left without any kind of support, of responses in terms of their situation. And this is something that should worry us. We also know that some of these women who resort to informal supports, who, for example, temporarily rely on these supports, they may not find in the homelessness services what they would like to find as a response to their needs at this early stage. And I can tell you that, for example, in Portugal, the services supporting homeless people in general, they tend to lack the skills to work with people who need to be supported in terms of housing housing which is not emergency housing responses. So, which means that women who are living in hidden situations, who do not have this heavily problematic mental health or other issues, who need a different kind of response, namely as regards they have been evicted, for example. They need a permanent housing response, not a temporary or an emergency housing response. And homelessness services are badly equipped in Portugal to respond to this. In Portugal, there's a big division between housing services and social welfare services. And this is a problem, this separation between the services in terms of providing the responses at earlier stages, when the responses that families or women need are basically this kind of responses. We also know that, as I told you, that women engage with homelessness services at a later point in their homelessness trajectory, and this also suggests that when they use these services, they very often, the effects of homelessness, the effects of the negative experiences they have been through, all this is much heavier in terms of their trajectory when they present to services. And this has consequences also in the interaction with services, with professionals, and with the responses that the services are given. And sometimes people say that women have more serious, when they appear to services, they have more serious issues than men. But if we have to look at their trajectory, when they appear, what have they been through when they get there? And this is something that we also need to think about. And finally, the use of services by homeless women is also linked, is also influenced by the type of services which is offered. If you offer housing-led services, if you offer housing-first services which provides ordinary housing, but also mobile support, or if you have versus the kind of support which is an emergency shelter, then you will have a different response from women, depending also on where they are in their trajectory. And this is something that is also important. And then we have this, the fact that, in fact, and with the huge variations between countries, we have still the dominant type of response across Europe is emergency short or medium-term accommodation, and this influences the use of service by women and the way and the choice they make to use or not the services which are available. And of course, the lack of appropriateness regarding the needs of homeless women and the lack of more gender-sensitive programs and services. And in the beginning of the session today, Beatriz Lazabal, if I'm saying this, she was saying about the importance of this approach where you focus on the persons rather than on the services. And this is something which is cross-cuts all this issue of the way women use the services and the responses which are given. And this is something that we have to move on to, not what we have available, but what people need to solve their situations. And we have also this disconnect between homelessness and domestic violence services. And this is very important because we know that there's this strong link. But then what we see in many countries is that there are no links between domestic violence services and homelessness services. Not only in terms of the registering of whether women appear or not, it's also in terms of the needs of the support women need. Women who experience homelessness, very often they need support in terms of dealing with the consequences of the violent experiences. And very often homelessness services are not equipped to provide this support. And if there are good examples in some countries where there is cooperation, there is training, for example, being provided between domestic violence services and homelessness service, and there is this very good cooperation. In other countries, this does not exist, and women are being served in these services without a full response to their needs. Regarding both the emotional support, the immediate safety, but also housing sustainment responses, which sometimes also domestic violence services cannot provide on a permanent basis and not on a temporary basis. And So women's trajectories are likely to be influenced by the nature and the operation of support services. And this is true, and we have this, we know that this is something that happens, and what I've said illustrates some of this, precisely of this final aspect. And one very final issue I would like to raise, and this is very briefly, is the importance of images of women's homelessness and how they influence service responses and engagements. We know that a lot of this inadequacy, this lack of engagement with services is also linked to the cultural constructions around women, around what is being a mother, what is being a female. And I do not have the time to develop this here, but it is true that women feel when they approach services. They sometimes feel that they feel a loss of autonomy. They feel, they avoid services because of the kind of interactions that they get from the services, the difficulty they have to exert their parenting responsibilities, for example, within an institutional setting. And so all these difficulties very often are influenced by these cultural constructions around women's homelessness and around the role of women in our society. And very briefly, what we need clearly to do, we need to enhance the evidence base on women's homelessness in Europe, and on homelessness in general, of course, but very particularly on women's homelessness, because women exist in all forms of homelessness, but very often we do not see them. We need more primary research, particularly as regards the need to capture these experiences of women living in situations of hidden homelessness, and this will influence our ability to respond adequately to earlier stages and to implement prevention strategies regarding homelessness. We certainly need more longitudinal research, because this will provide us a much better understanding on the dynamics of homelessness. And it's very different when you look cross-sectionally, or when you look within this dynamic perspective, you see different things. And these different things may be very useful for policies and for practice. And we clearly need to critically appraise service provision for homeless women in terms of the nature of this provision, but also in terms of the way it is being run, how it is being provided. So, and this is, if we want to respond to women's needs during their homelessness trajectories. And finally, homelessness policy agendas, as I've already highlighted before, including the development of strategic responses to homelessness, need to recognize, not only to note that women are there, but to understand how the presence of women and how their needs often have to be responded in different ways. And finally, I just want to share with you this edition of this on women's homelessness in Europe, which was released early this year, and which was the result of a collaboration of this network, the Women's Homelessness in Europe network, where I also collaborate, and which is available and which you can we can access, and which gives you a good overview of women's homelessness. And that's all. Thank you very much. Obrigada, as you say in Portuguese. And thank you.
Muchas gracias.